The gospel reading this morning is from the Gospel of St. John, beginning in chapter 15, verses 26 to 27, and then continuing through chapter 16, verse 15. This is the words of Jesus talking to his disciples, and it's Jesus talking to his people, which means that it's Jesus essentially talking to us. It's words about the life of the Spirit in the life of the church and in the life of the individual. And I think from this we can understand a little bit about what is promised to us, and we can understand not only what is promised to us, but how we're to respond accordingly. And I think there's a lot in this passage that speaks to us as the people of God. So I invite you to listen to the words of Jesus from the Gospel of St. John. When the Advocate comes, whom I will send you from the Father, the Spirit of truth, who proceeds from the Father, he will testify about me. You also must testify, because you have been with me from the beginning. All this I have told you, so that you will not fall away. They will put you out of the synagogue. In fact, the time is coming when anyone who kills you will think they are offering a service to God. They will do this because they have not known the Father or me. I have told you these things so that when their time comes, you may remember that I warned you about them. I did not tell you this from the beginning because I was still with you. But now I am going to the one who sent me. And none of you asks, where are you going? Instead, you are filled with grief because I have said these things. Very truly, I tell you, it is for your good that I go away. For if I do not go away, the Advocate will not come to you. But if I do go away, I will send him to you. And when he comes, he will prove the world to be wrong about sin, righteousness, and judgment. About sin, because people don't believe in me. About righteousness, because I'm going to the Father, while you will no longer see me. About judgment, because the prince of this world now stands condemned. I have much more to say to you, more than you could now bear. But when he, the Spirit of truth, comes, he will guide you into all truth. He will not speak of himself. He will speak what he hears. He will glorify me, because it is from me that he will receive what he is to make known to you. All that the Father has, all that belongs to the Father, is mine. That's why I said, the Spirit will receive from me what he will make known to you. This is the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Thanks be to God.
Happy Pentecost. This is the Pentecost celebration, the entrance of the Spirit into the life of the church. Now we know that the Spirit had always been present in the life of the church. The Spirit had always been present in the lives of God's people throughout all of the Old Testament. Over and over again in the Old Testament, we're told that the Spirit of God would come upon a person and things would happen, gifts would be manifested, and miracles would take place. This was happening even before the day of Pentecost, but there's something significant about Pentecost. Now we know historically that Pentecost was an ancient Israelite holiday. In fact, it was one of those holidays in which Israelites would intentionally go back to Jerusalem in order to celebrate. They had a few of those holidays where the Jews would leave their home and travel to Jerusalem to celebrate together in Jerusalem. That was always the ideal. Everybody wanted to do that. And that's what was happening during this Pentecost, in which the Spirit became manifest in the life of the church. Apparently, it was during the Pentecost celebration that the Jews were having every year, everybody from all over the world, if they were Jewish, they came back to Jerusalem in order to celebrate. You see, in the first century, they knew how to party. A party wouldn't last just for one day and then be done. You see, for us, a party is all day and then we clean up. For them, they party, and then they party, and then they keep on partying. And maybe they'll clean up following the party, and then they'll party some more. So the Pentecost celebration wasn't necessarily a one-day celebration. It was sometimes a 2 or 3 day celebration, maybe even longer. That's the way celebrations were held. So it made perfect sense then that there were people from all over the known world in Jerusalem to celebrate the Jewish Pentecost holiday. The Pentecost holiday in Judaism signified a couple things. First of all, Pentecost means 50, right? And so the celebration of Pentecost was 50 days after the Passover. It signified the first barley harvest, the first grain harvest that was coming in, and they celebrated the harvest time. Secondly, Pentecost was the celebration of the giving of the Torah. The Torah was the law that identified the Jewish people for who they were. You see, apparently, when the Jews were living in Jerusalem, their land was their identity. When their land and their temple, these physical things, were taken away from them, they had to have something by which they identified themselves. Their law had been with them throughout all their history. The Jewish people identified themselves by their law. Even in the New Testament, we have Jesus in the writings of John and the writer of the book of John talking about law proceeding through Moses. And that's acknowledged throughout. In the writings of St. Paul, he says Jesus didn't come to destroy the law. That's the identity of the people. Jesus came to fulfill the law. So the law was that by which the people identified themselves. So Jewish people then, in celebrating Pentecost and partying all over town and traveling sometimes hundreds of miles in order to get there, they were celebrating that by which they had their own identity. This is our identity. This is the law. And we're celebrating the giving of the law to the people 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years or 1,000 years prior to the time of their celebration. So people were in Jerusalem celebrating the birth of the Torah. There were probably about 120 Christians who were huddled together in the temple. They were praying. They were scared. Jesus had died. Jesus had risen from the dead. But how could they convince the people that that happened? The same people who killed Jesus weren't terribly fond of the disciples. So their death was always a possibility. So you have a handful of disciples who are together praying in the temple, wondering what their next step would be, and wondering what their identity is going to be. You see, it's kind of neat to pigeonhole people, isn't it? Everybody's got an identity. You know, you look at me and you see the short, bald-headed, chubby guy. You know, I got an identity. You know, I am a Presbyterian. I have an identity. We like to identify people when we talk about them. You know, that guy over there who had the long hair and the funny hat. You know, we identify people. Well, in the first century, the Roman government, who had a whole bunch of groups of people under their control, would love to identify groups of people, pigeonhole them, put them in their box, as it were. But these Christians didn't really have a box where they fit. The Jews really didn't want them to be Jews because they didn't hold true to the things Jewish people held true to. But yet the Romans didn't have any other place to put them. So you have these Christians who, number one, are scared for their own lives, and secondly, wondering what their identity is going to be. And quite frankly, a few of the Christians would fall away because of that. Now, in this particular reading, Jesus is giving us, the people of God, not only some history, but some futuristic things for them to look forward to. You see, Jesus mentioned that they would be put out of the synagogue. Jesus told them their identity would be challenged. Jesus said the group that you identify with won't accept you and allow your identity there. Jesus told them that people would see their religious responsibility as getting rid of these Christians. People will put you to death thinking they're doing God a service. It is their religion and their faithfulness to God to put Christians to death. So Jesus was telling the Christians something that was going to go on in their future and things they needed to hang on to and to look at that. Now, in the context of this, in the context of the words of Jesus, the praying disciples, and the party going on in Jerusalem, we have this particular reading about the work of the Spirit and the place of the Spirit in our lives. And I think it would be kind of good to talk about that just for a few moments. The work of the advocate. Jesus said the advocate is going to come. And he said the advocate was the Spirit of truth that would proceed from the Father. And Jesus also said that because the Spirit proceeds from the Father, the Spirit is from Jesus as well. Suggesting that there's a connection. Suggesting for me a Trinitarian connection. Jesus said the Spirit will come to you and will be there for you. And he called the Spirit of truth. Now, I'm really fascinated by the word that Jesus used in order to name the Spirit. The Spirit is referred to as the advocate. That means God is on your side. The Spirit is there to support and be present for you. I think that stands in major contrast to a lot of religious teaching, even a lot of secular teaching that demands accountability, that demands us to always seek forgiveness because of all the awfulness and the sins we've committed. But Jesus speaks to the contrary. Jesus said, the Spirit is your advocate. The Spirit is there for you. The Spirit is alongside to help you. In the songs that we sang this morning, we sang songs saying that God is our very breath. And God is there for our help. And we depend on God for our strength and our sustenance. And sometimes even for our own existence. The Spirit is not a judgmental spirit. The Spirit is not fragile. The Spirit is there to help. And I would contend that there's nothing that we can do, or no situation that we can face, that the Spirit doesn't have the power, the ability, and the desire to be there for you. The advocate is there for you. That's the ministry of the Spirit in your life here and today. We get this sense sometimes that our life is this big test, and God is watching. And God is throwing things out in the way to see if we might trip. And if He's got us, then there's one down and we've got to find a way to make up for it. It's almost as though we are puppets and God is the puppet master. We are here to do God's will, and if we don't do it, we're condemned. We get that feeling sometimes in a whole lot of Christian theology. Churches, preachers, and even teachers will tell us that's the way things are. But I would contend that that is not the teaching of the New Testament. God is not a puppet master. God's desire is not to watch us and see if we're going to fall. I don't think God is particularly that bored. I think God is there as an advocate. God is there to help. You see, life itself is difficult enough. And it's just the way things are. God's presence is in our lives in advocacy to help us live the life that we have called to live. God is not there to try us tempt us, see if we make it. The Spirit is described as an advocate in the words of Jesus. He's here to help. That's the purpose. When we recognize that, we can tap into all kinds of help, all kinds of strength. We can achieve things we never knew was possible because of the presence of the Spirit, the advocate, the one called alongside to help. He's on your side no matter what. The Spirit is the advocate. Secondly, in the presence of the Spirit, we have the power of conviction. This major power that comes with a conviction. Jesus said that when the Spirit comes, He will convict the world of sin, righteousness, and judgment. In other words, there will be major conviction as to what is right and how we're to live in the presence of the Spirit. The Spirit empowers. The Spirit gives conviction, and that gives motivation. That enables. You see, if the Spirit were here to condemn, then that would disable. That would disempower. And it wouldn't empower us to do the work that we're called to do. But you see, the Spirit gives us conviction about who we are. The Spirit proves that we have this ability and this calling. And the Spirit gives us that with conviction, a powerful belief, a knowledge of we can do it, we can accomplish, and we're called to accomplish. I honestly believe that a lot of us fail to accomplish certain things in our lives, not because we're unable to, but because we've convinced ourselves that we can't. And I think the only thing standing in the way of us accomplishing everything God has called us to do is our simply believing that we can do it. Jesus said, the Spirit is there to give you the power of conviction. Be convicted that things that this world system says and presents aren't necessarily true. Have a conviction that just because the world says you can't, doesn't mean that God is saying you can't. God is much more interested, if we take the New Testament seriously, God is much more interested in what you can accomplish, what you can do, than He is in what you can't do. The Spirit is here to give us conviction, the motivation, and the drive. That's there. That's for us. I invite you to tap into that. Make that your Pentecost experience. And finally, in this reading, we have a living out of the story of Pentecost. The story of Pentecost is the Spirit coming into the lives of God's people, empowering and enabling them to share the gospel of Christ with everyone with whom they come in contact. It was a party, a celebration. It was at that time that the church was born. These people who were scared, wondering what their identity was going to be, questioning their own future, these same people were empowered, inspired, and they had the strength and the hope, and they gained an identity. You see, in the Spirit, they gained an identity of who Christ was. First of all, Jesus said, the Spirit would take from me and then make it known to you. The Spirit would testify about Jesus. That means that our knowledge of Jesus becomes more complete and more real because of the presence of the Spirit in our lives. At that moment, the people of God gained their identity. This is our identity. And their identity became the phrase Christos Kurios, which is the Greek phrase, Christ is Lord, or Christ is God. That meant that their identity was in Jesus Christ. The identity of the Jewish people prior to the coming of the Spirit was in their land, their temple, their law. But in the presence of the Spirit, the identity of the people is Christ is God. That's the Pentecost story. That's our identity. And then secondly, I find it very fascinating that the giving of the law and the receiving of the Spirit are celebrated on the same day. The giving of the law, which, according to St. Paul, was in many ways inhibiting. It gave you rules by which you have to live. But the Spirit gives life. In the writings of St. Paul, we have the two counter-imposed to one another. The Spirit and the law. The law inhibits, the Spirit gives life. The law makes demands. The Spirit helps you live it out naturally. You see, the law was given just to maintain order. And sometimes the only way you know something is wrong is because there's a law against it. The only way you know it's a sin is because somebody tells you it's a sin. But the Spirit comes along, not necessarily to abolish, but to fulfill. In the Spirit, we do, just in living our lives, what the law would have us to do by intentionally commanding us to obey precepts. The Spirit gives life, and in living of that life, we're going to live out automatically what the law says. You see, the Spirit gives life, which calls us to be in right relationship with one another, to love each other. If we have that relationship, if we live that life of relationship, then we're automatically doing what the law says to do. Now come on. I suppose that if you really love your neighbor, you're not going to kill them, right? Thou shalt not kill. If you really love your neighbor, you're not going to lie to them or take advantage of them. Thou shalt not bear false witness, etc., etc. It's all fulfilled in the Spirit, because in the Spirit we have the power to live out the law, rather than the law having power over us and its demands. The law and the Spirit given on the same day. We are Pentecost people. We are people of the Spirit. Let's pray. Holy God, teach us every day what it means to be people of the Spirit. We pray this in the name of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.